Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. Have I yet assigned him Mission Impossible? Well, the short answer to that question is no. Am I likely to do that this morning? I'd say the short answer to that question is possibly no. However, I do live in the hope that I might actually achieve it one day. We're joined by our friend Richard Kazimer from the United States, who happens to be on the other end of the phone. Morning.
Good morning, sir. You know, we're getting closer and closer. Man, can you pick the topics? Before we reveal what it is, I just want to know, did you pick this topic because I said last week was my birthday? Is this a hint?
No. Actually, funnily enough, it's because one of those things that ultimately at some point affects us all. But there are some interesting points. I'm actually going to be interested, and I'm telling you the truth here, I'm actually going to be interested to see if there are any similarities between where you are and where we are. And I suspect, I could be wrong, but I suspect some of the things I'm going to tell you are going to surprise you. Let's put it that way. Now, I'll leave it to you this morning. By the way, if you want to be this man's friend on Facebook, Richard S. Kazimer. Kazimer is spelled Kazimer. Now, if you want to be his friend on Facebook, all you have to do is ask, and he'll say yes. He'll say yes to everybody. My friend, I'm going to leave it up to you this morning to reveal our subject, which is...
Cemeteries.
That's right, cemeteries. Your last place.
Well, not mine.
The last place that you will ever own any real estate. Now, let's start from the beginning. We get the impression here, certainly from this side of the ocean, we get the impression that most people in the United States are still burials. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. Cremation is very big here. At the risk of making a lot of puns and jokes.
Let's not do that, only because somebody somewhere will get offended. I mean, I can tell you that for nothing.
And I don't want to do that because last Christmas we put my wife's grandfather and grandmother in the grave. They died within a month of each other, and they had a long and fruitful life. But it is a very trying period. But it is a huge industry over here because everybody, as you pointed out, everybody at some point needs to use the service. And it's not something that people talk about, unfortunately, until you're up to that point. And that's why the industry is kind of in this paradox where it's kind of in bad taste, or you're kind of crossing a line when you promote the industry and promote the need for burials, and yet it's a subject that people really don't want to talk about. There's a lot of facets to that industry. One of the things that I was looking at in my research was that we think that graves need to be 6 feet deep. And I was really surprised to find out that no, graves do not need to be 6 feet deep. I think where that came from was the Great Plague of London in 1665. There was, in a fictional book, there was an actual factual recorded edict by the London City Lord Mayor that required all graves be made at least 6 feet deep to curtail the spread of the plague. But of course we know that it was fleas jumping off of rats that were living in human filth that caused the plague, so it really didn't make any difference whether 6 feet or 100 feet where you buried the departed would do anything. It didn't.
Well, you know what the said reason for 6 foot was, don't you? It was said that was the depth at which surface-bearing insects could not find their way down to the body.
But then you do want that to happen eventually anyway for decomposition.
Now, the interesting point is that here in West Australia, they've started to offer a thing which is based on people who have environmental concerns, and it's called a natural burial. In a natural burial, you don't actually have to be 6 foot down. The figure given, according to the Metropolitan Cemeteries Board, is 1.4 metres. Okay. So that's rather interesting. And that, by the way, is just over, 4.5 feet?
Yes. What I found out in a conventional burial here is that there is no national minimum depth requirement for graves. Now, each state and local municipality can impose their own depth requirements. Generally, it's 18 inches to a couple of feet. That will suffice. Areas such as New England and the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest, where they experience freezing winter temperatures, normally they'll use the 6 foot rule to have that casket below the permafrost line to avoid excessive moisture, and also the buckling and expansion and contraction from the ground freezing and thawing. So here in New England we do, and the plots that I've seen firsthand have always been 6 feet deep. If you have a family plot, you can actually have that done with some preparation, that the first person who uses the plot is down 12 feet, and then you can start stacking family members to consolidate the space.
Yeah, that happens here too.
Low-lying areas that are below sea level, like New Orleans, that have high water tables, tables. They have used the above-ground interments for well over a century. The last thing anybody wants is for a casket to fill up with water and come popping out of the ground, which has happened. Now, what you were saying about the natural burial plots is that I was not quite aware of that until you had mentioned it when you told me about the subject we were going to be doing. And I found that there were 18 registered natural burial preserves, they're called, here in the United States. Several of them are right here in New England, in Maine. And it seems to be a very pristine way of doing things, a very natural way of doing things. It's environmentally friendly. It's a sustainable alternative to existing funeral practices. The body is not embalmed. It's returned to the earth to decompose naturally. It's in very pristine and well-maintained preserves with a nice ecological balance. And it's great for, obviously, the departed who are there, the natural environment, and the families who are going to visit these areas.
Well, of course, one of the reasons why people are attracted to that is because as people more and more become environmentally aware and share their environmental concerns, I guess something like that is going to have appeal, isn't it?
It's also not only ecologically friendly, but also economically friendly as well. Although I couldn't find any cost, usually when you go to these websites, that they don't actually list prices. It's almost like car dealerships with everything is negotiable. So they don't really list prices, but the natural burial sites were saying that they were far less than they were for the conventional sites, which I found could be as low as $1,500 to the sky's the limit, however elaborate you want. The burial plot, the internment, the casket, you can spend as much money as you possibly can, or as little as you possibly can.
Now, the other interesting issue is, in the case of the United States, are you aware of the difference or the ratio of burials to cremations?
I don't have any concrete figures, but what I'm to understand in the folks that I have been talking with is that there are more cremations now than heretofore, and simply because, and also for a large demographic as well, where you're getting more elderly people and younger people being, 55 and on down, that are opting for cremation than the conventional burial site. Cost is an issue there as well, but from a personal standpoint, people are opting for it because it provides an absolute control over the remains of your departed, if not a more lasting and personal bond with that person, with whatever you do with the ashes. You want to keep them at home or spread them over, a favorite place that the departed liked. So I think it's a really good thing. Plus, there's not that stigma as much as in years past, especially with Christians and Catholicism, where cremation was frowned upon, if not banned. We're seeing more and more of that as a viable option and a very acceptable option to the conventional burial.
Yeah, well, I know the figure here is about 75% of all funerals in Australia are cremations. And certainly the survey that I've done over this last week of the Metropolitan Cemeteries Board website would indicate that that's certainly the case here in West Australia as well. Something else that's interesting, if somebody, for example, has a burial plot, how long do you actually own that burial plot for in the United States, and certainly in the areas with which you are familiar?
You own that plot forever. In the U.S., your rights in burial plots are perpetual. The relatives of the deceased have a perpetual right to visit and maintain the grave and the headstone, and they can sue to prevent desecration, neglect, or removal of the body. Now, there could be some optional groundskeeping fees, but that's all up front when you buy the plot. But when somebody buys a burial plot, that cemetery cannot legally impose any time limit whatsoever to make room for new customers. Now, should the cemetery change hands at any time or run into legal problems, the courts are very quick to step in on behalf of the deceased and the families. And any reputable cemetery will have a solid perpetual care fund on hand to ensure the proper maintenance of the facilities so that they're not nickel and diming the families to keep the plots up and in pristine condition, or else with the threat of removal.
When you talk about removal, are you talking about literally removal?
There have been some scenarios where bodies have been removed and placed elsewhere in a not so ideal location in a cemetery to put in somebody who is going to spend more money. That is illegal, and as I was about to say, we've had some scenarios here in the past few years where some funeral directors and cemetery owners, particularly down south, were not providing the services that they were paid for. There were bodies that were found in the back of the cemeteries or back of these funeral parlors, exposed or in very shallow graves, and nobody was put in the ground in cemeteries, and yet they were taking all sorts of money to do this. Now, when that was discovered, the industry just went ballistic and made a wholehearted effort to make sure that these people were prosecuted and they are serving time. These are very rare instances, and the penalties are very severe for that to happen. But as I say, when you buy a cemetery plot, that is perpetual. You cannot be removed or denied access to it.
Is that pretty well uniform over the country, is it?
Absolutely, yes. You know, and that's why, again, I can't stress enough that either for yourself or a member of your family, the best time is now to start planning for this. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it's the same thing as buying a house, because your house can be foreclosed upon and repossessed, but when you put your money down for that plot, that is it. That's a signed deal, and that is perpetual. You don't own the cemetery, but you own that little plot of land forever.
Guess what?
Yes, sir.
You don't in West Australia.
That's odd.
Do you know how long you have it for?
How long?
25 years, with an option to renew for another 25 years. After that, it reverts back to the Metropolitan Cemeteries Board, and they can, and they have done, a thing called cemetery renewal, where they remove the old headstones and they bury in between the old graves and basically create new burial plots. It's been fairly controversial, but it's something they do. Basically, you can go beyond the 25 plus 25, but you have to get the Cemeteries Board to agree. And I think they figure the chances are 50 years after somebody's died, the relatives that remain will have little, if any, interest in maintaining their grave.
That's a good point, and I would imagine that, and again, I'm particularly because this is such an old country, and there are many, many old cemeteries around here with limited space, that it's not unusual to walk through any cemetery here in New England and see grave sites back to the 1600s or even earlier. Now, what are the chances that there's still family members that are visiting these grave sites? Probably 0 to none. So the cemetery management company are going to do what they can to preserve that or conserve space, but as far as digging people up and then moving them elsewhere, it doesn't happen. I've not heard that.
What happens here is they don't dig people up. They simply remove the headstones and bury in between. Where you had the vacant area between two graves, they'll then put a new grave in. This has taken place a lot at Karrakatta, which of course is the oldest cemetery. Fremantle doesn't seem to have that problem yet, simply because it hasn't run out of real estate yet. And Pinaroo, which is obviously a newer cemetery, as is the one at Baldivis, they haven't struck that issue yet. But I can imagine that to people like yourself, it sort of seems odd. And in some respects, it actually seems odd, bearing in mind that, as you've identified here, I mean, already here, the vast majority of funerals are cremations. That number is increasing. There are some traditional people, and of course there are traditional groups, for example, who go for mausoleum interments and that sort of stuff as well, or entombments as they call them. But even when you have a look at the mausoleum, I mean, the mausoleum here is horrendously expensive. But once again, you only own the grant of right for 25 years. So I guess after 25 years, you find your way into the ossuary.
They may be putting unrelated departed caskets closer together than years before. But let's say, for example, if my family bought an 8-foot by 10-foot plot to put in X amount of people, the cemetery cannot legally infringe upon that plot no matter how long or how much space they're running out of. That's the difference between if you just go to the cemetery and they put you in the best available location. A cemetery plot is considered that hallowed ground that you purchase. And if I buy an 8 by 10 plot, nobody can touch that. If I just go to the cemetery with my family member and say, put them where you can, a nice view if possible, I take my chances on the best plot available.
It's amazing stuff. I know it sounds a bit macabre to talk about this sort of thing, but I guess as time goes by, the rules change, and I think that's probably what people got caught about here, was that some of the rules change, and for some people, the prospect that you might actually have your last resting place, which is not permanent, is a little bit difficult to grapple with. Like you said, there's a fair amount of history. What about the future? Of course, one of the reasons why they talk about the need to do renewals and all that sort of stuff here is simply the availability of land. If you talk about one of our older and more traditional cemeteries like Karrakatta, it basically is boxed in. There is no further land available. It's a huge tract of land, but there is no further land available. It's been in use for well over 100 years, and basically they started to run out of space. I kind of imagine there must be the same sort of situation in the US with some of your cemeteries too.
When you look at some of the suburban areas that were farmland and fields and then were converted into cemeteries, that space is now under development for the urban sprawl. So these local communities are running out of space very quickly. So what it is it's first come, first serve. The prices go up, and if you can afford it, then you're put someplace. Veterans, for example, there are separate veterans cemeteries. Both of my parents are buried quite a distance from where they grew up and where they raised me, but they are in a veterans cemetery in the capital of Maine because that's where the veterans go, and my father was a retired vet. The same thing with my wife's grandfather and grandmother. They were very active in the American Legion. So there are places to go for that, but I would foresee a time out of sheer necessity that we will have to change how we dispose of our loved ones.
Is there ever going to be a time, and is this a subject, when you think about it, that is the people are really ever going to be able to grapple with? I mean, I can accept this morning there'd be a few people thinking, gee, this subject's got a bit of an ick factor. And look, for a lot of people it probably has for fairly obvious reasons. But I know, for example, when they changed, for example, the right of burial here, it was just sort of changed with an Act of Parliament. It was the Cemeteries Act of 1986. Which meant that people who suddenly found a situation where they might have 20 years ago bought a plot for their grandparents or something like that, suddenly found that they no longer had an enduring or perpetual right to that plot, simply because somewhere down the track somebody sat down and said, hey, we're going to run out of space here, and there isn't really any option to increase the space, so what are we going to do? It's one of those things that was never really talked about a lot, simply because I suspect a lot of people didn't want to talk about it because it's one of those subjects that people don't feel comfortable about. And because you don't feel comfortable about it, you just don't talk about it, do you?
And that's one of the things that I highly recommend, and I've got a couple of friends actually that are in the industry, that they love doing this, and they're very accommodating and understanding people. And I would highly recommend that you go through your phone book or do some web research and find somebody in your local area, if not to make plans now, but at least to sit down and discuss this. It's no different than if you went to a nursing home or your doctor and discuss things of very personal nature, but as a subject matter that you really don't want to talk about. That's what these people are there for, and you've got to trust them. Make sure you get everything in writing. Make sure you ask questions. But as you say, sooner or later, we're all going to have to deal with this.
That's exactly right. And some of the issues and the changing circumstances probably dictate that the terms and conditions under which people do things will inevitably, over a period of time, change, even if you're not here to see that change. It's a change that could relate to your remains, that could affect your loved ones. I mean, interestingly enough, as I said before, for the majority of people, certainly here in West Australia, it's probably largely a moot point because most people are cremated. Anyway, Richard, thank you very much for that. As always, fascinating. Don't forget, if you'd like to be this man's friend on Facebook, Richard S. Kazimer, Kazimer is how you spell it. Or if you're in America, Kazimer. We'll talk next week, my friend.
All right, brother. Stay above ground. I'll do the same.